Okay, last but not least, we have the angiosperms. Angiosperms include all of the plants that produce flowers. So we call these the flowering plants. Flowering plants. Okay, so angiosperms, a very characteristic thing is that they have flowers. That's our first bullet point. Have flowers. Okay, and then what a flower ends up leading to after a flower is produced, what that can end up leading to is the production of seeds, and those seeds are stored inside of an ovary. The ovary is just a protective structure around the seeds. So this ends up leading to the plant bearing seeds. Bears seeds within a protective ovary or ovaries. Okay, and the presence of the ovaries, this is what sets the seeds of angiosperms apart from the seeds of gymnosperms. They are stored in a different structure. The angiosperms include many familiar plants. In fact, most of the familiar plants are in this category. It includes fresh fruits and vegetables. Fruits and vegetables are all angiosperms. Vegetables, a lot of crops that are produced for food, grains, grasses are angiosperms. They produce tiny little flowers. We usually don't even notice them, but grass flowers do exist. And actually there are a lot of trees that are angiosperms as well, so many trees. Okay, so there are some trees that do not produce flowers, those are the gymnosperms, and there are others that do produce flowers, and those are angiosperms. We're going to focus in on the flower structure, since flowers are so characteristic of angiosperms. Let's see if we can identify the key structures inside of a flower. Flowers are the reproductive sites for the angiosperms. Flowers are reproductive structures, sites of reproduction. For the angiosperms. And all flowers have a few key things in common. Of course, the petals come in a lot of varieties, a lot of different shapes and colors, but the structure that the petals are wrapped around, sort of what's on the inside of the flower, there's quite a bit of consistency when we compare from one flower to the next. So all of them, I'm going to start in the middle. The very center of the flower has a structure called the carpel. And this is the female reproductive structure in the plant, the carpel. At the tip of the carpel is a sticky structure. This is called the stigma. And then around this, there are usually some stalks with little heads on the tips. Just draw a few of these. Come off kind of more to the sides a little bit. And these other stalks that I'm drawing, these are the male structures within the flower. What these are called are the stamens. Each of these stalks is called a stamen. And at the very tip of the stamen is an anther. That's this kind of head group at the end. This is called an anther. That anther is where pollen is produced. And in order for fertilization to take place, the pollen from the anther just needs to make it over to the stigma. And then from there, what's going to happen, it's kind of like a tube will grow down into this structure, and the fertilized egg is going to mature right there, and it's going to end up producing a seed. So let's just add some petals onto our flower. Petals are sort of going to sort of envelop the rest of the structure. So petals, however you want to draw them. Petals, right? Around the whole thing. Okay, let's identify some key things here. So the carpel, let's see, maybe I can just grab a highlighter. The carpel, this is the female reproductive structure of the plant. And the stamen and the anther, these are the male reproductive structures. And the anther, anther is what produces pollen. This sticky tip on the carpel, it's called the stigma. The stigma traps the pollen that the anther produces. Traps pollen. And that's why it is sticky. Okay, so the main plant body for angiosperms, the main plant body is a sporophyte. And I'm just going to write out a little bit of sort of the life cycle in an angiosperm, what takes place. So in the sporophyte, now that we've talked about those different structures, in the sporophyte, here's what takes place. You know, pollen grain from an anther has to come over and land on a stigma. That's the first step. So pollen grain lands on stigma. And what happens next is the pollen will grow a tube down, down the carpel. Pollen tube forms. Pollen tube grows down to the ovule, which is down here in the base of the carpel. Okay, next, fertilization has to take place. So the sperm cell has a nucleus, and that nucleus is going to travel down that pollen tube that just formed. So the nucleus gets sent down the tube. Sperm nucleus travels via that tube down to the egg and fertilizes it. So a fertilized egg, now this is called a zygote. It's going to be diploid. That diploid zygote will develop into an embryo, undergoes cell division, develops into an embryo. And that embryo in the plant is surrounded by a food supply. Embryo, which is surrounded by a food supply. That food supply is called an endosperm. Food supply called an endosperm. Okay, so it's an embryo, it's got a food supply, it's got what it needs in order to survive for some time, and this whole ovule with the food supply, this is what is going to develop into a seed. It's going to become a seed that can last for many years. The ovule develops into a seed. The seed then is capable of germinating and growing into a new sporophyte plant body. Can germinate and, germinate and form a new sporophyte plant. So when we talk about a fruit, what is a fruit? Fruit is just a ripened ovary, and it can contain multiple of these ovules. We'll give an example of this in just a second. Fruit is just a ripened ovary from a plant. Ripened ovary. So this encloses the seeds, usually seeds plural. A good familiar example to practice with these terms. So informally, we like to talk about fruits and vegetables. In the context of botany and plants, the distinguishing characteristics between those two groupings is not very clear. So both of those plant types, like fruits and vegetables, they all technically produce fruits. They're all angiosperms, they all produce fruits. So this example might seem strange if you didn't have that in mind going into this. The example I'm going to put down for fruit is actually a pea pod. And that would be considered a fruit. Pea pod, what this is a ripened ovary from a pea plant. Ripened ovary. And the individual peas are the mature ovules. So each of those can end up being a seed if we allow them to go that far before we eat them. Peas are just mature ovules. Okay, there you have it. So once a seed is formed, there are a few different ways that it can be distributed. So seed dispersal. Seeds can be dispersed by the wind. Wind is sufficient in many cases. Wind dispersal. Some seeds are more easily spread by wind than others. So if you think of think of a dandelion, right? The puffy things that it's fun to blow them off. The wind is very good at making those travel because they have like those little parachute things. Other seeds are heavier and wind wouldn't do such a good job for those. So some other ways that seeds can be dispersed would be, for example, by using animals, animal transportation. Animal transportation. For example, there are some seeds that just stick to fur and our socks. They get trapped. So animal transportation. A good example of that is cockleburrs. And then finally, also using animals, animal ingestion. Animal ingestion. Okay, so remember with the angiosperms, remember the seeds are enclosed in this really protective structure, the protective ovary. And it turns out when animals eat fruits, sometimes the seeds survive digestion. So the animal eats the fruit, gets the fleshy part, gets the nutrients from that, and the seed just passes through sort of unfazed. The seed is still able to germinate even after passing all the way through the animal's digestive tract. So yeah, that's a third way that seeds can be dispersed.